He didn't bark. He argued. Every morning at 0600 sharp, before the coffee finished dripping and before the sun cleared the pine trees behind the little rental house outside Camp Pendleton, Ranger planted himself in the middle of the kitchen floor and began what Ethan Walker had come to think of as a full military briefing delivered in fur. Not loud, not wild. Just a string of grumbles, husky little groans, and drawn-out complaints that rose and fell with such stubborn rhythm it sounded less like a dog making noise and more like a soul with opinions. Ethan stood there in gray sweats and an old Marine Corps t-shirt, one hand around a chipped coffee mug, the other resting on the edge of the counter, staring down at the rescued German shepherd like he was trying to decode a foreign language he had somehow been assigned to live with. Ranger answered the stare with amber eyes, one ear tilted forward, the other just slightly off, as if even his posture carried sarcasm. Then he let out another sound, longer this time, low and dramatic, like he was deeply disappointed by the pace of breakfast, the state of the world, and possibly Ethan's entire attitude. "You got something to say, buddy?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with sleep. Ranger sat taller and answered immediately. Ethan blinked. The house was small, neat, and quiet in the way homes get quiet when only one person has lived in them too long. A wooden table. 2 chairs, though only one was ever used. A faded service flag, folded carefully on a side shelf. Boots lined up by the door with the kind of precision that survives long after uniform becomes memory. Outside, the California morning still held that cool breath before the heat settled in. Somewhere down the street, a pickup started. A sprinkler hissed over a patch of thirsty grass. But inside that kitchen, there was only the scent of black coffee, the pale gold of early light on the linoleum, and Ranger continuing his strange little sermon like he had waited all night to make his case. Ethan had brought him home 3 weeks earlier from a rescue shelter 20 miles inland, telling himself it was temporary, just a good deed, just a dog that needed a place to land. That was the story he gave other people anyway. The truth was, the shepherd had looked at him through the kennel gate with a kind of battered defiance that felt uncomfortably familiar. Not broken. Not begging. Just watchful. Like he had already been disappointed by the world and had not yet decided whether Ethan belonged in the same category. Since then, Ranger had learned the house fast. Learned the timing of drawers, the meaning of keys, the holy ritual of toast crusts, the exact second Ethan's boots meant departure. But more than that, he had developed this habit of talking back whenever silence grew too heavy. Especially in the morning. Especially when Ethan drifted too far into himself. Ranger gave another rumbling complaint and padded 2 steps closer, nails clicking softly on the floor. Ethan looked down into his coffee, then back at the dog, and for the first time in longer than he cared to measure, the corner of his mouth moved before the rest of him did. It wasn't much. Just the beginning of a smile. But in that quiet kitchen, it felt like the first crack in a locked room. By the time the sun climbed over the low hills beyond Oceanside and turned the kitchen window white with morning glare, Ethan had already lost the argument. Ranger had followed him from the coffee maker to the sink, from the sink to the hallway, and from the hallway back to the front door, delivering a running stream of sounds that somehow carried both urgency and offense, as if Ethan had violated an agreement neither of them remembered signing. "I am leaving for exactly 40 minutes, Ethan said, crouching to lace his boots. "You have food. You have water. You have a yard that is bigger than my first apartment." Ranger stared at him, chest lifted, ears alert, and answered with a long, rising groan that could have passed for disbelief. Ethan shook his head, but there it was again, that almost smile, small and unwilling, pulling at one side of his face before he stood and reached for his keys. 3 weeks ago, silence had ruled this house so completely that even the refrigerator hum felt too loud at night. Ethan had not minded it, or at least that was what he told himself. After 12 years in the Marine Corps, quiet seemed practical. Orderly. Safer than letting too much life gather in one place. His routines were measured down. To the minute. Wake at 0530. Coffee at 0540. Run if his knee held up. Shower. Clean shave unless he had nowhere to be. laundry on Thursdays, groceries on Sundays. The kind of rhythm built by a man who trusted structure more than comfort. But Ranger had stepped into that rhythm like he had his own amendments to file. He had turned bootlacing into negotiation, mealtimes into debate, and every closed bathroom door into a personal betrayal. He also had a habit of planting himself by the living room window whenever Ethan fell too still, watching him with the patient concern of a medic who knew something was wrong before the man on the cot admitted it. That morning, Ethan finally clipped on the leash, not because he needed to take Ranger with him, but because the dog had already made it clear the discussion would not end otherwise. The neighborhood was waking up as they stepped outside. Marine housing sat a few blocks over, but Ethan rented farther out, in a weathered one-story place with pale siding, a chain-link fence, and a front patch of grass that never quite decided whether to live or quit. The air smelled like salt, damp earth, and someone's bacon drifting from an open window down the street. A flag snapped lazily from a porch 2 houses over. A woman in pink running shoes waved while collecting her newspaper. Ethan returned the gesture with a nod. Ranger, meanwhile, trotted beside him like a self-appointed escort, tail level, posture proud, occasionally glancing up to issue soft remarks under his breath whenever Ethan did not move at a pace he approved of. At the corner, Ethan stopped near the mailbox cluster and checked his watch. Ranger sat. Then came another sound, shorter this time, almost conversational. Ethan looked down. What now? Ranger tilted his head and gave a quieter answer, one that sounded less like complaint and more like concern. Ethan studied the dog for a second longer than he meant to. There was something unnervingly specific in the timing of it all. Ranger did not simply make noise. He responded. He filled gaps. He interrupted the exact moments when Ethan's mind drifted someplace dim and distant, as if he could hear silence gathering before Ethan even felt it himself. The thought should have been ridiculous. Instead, standing there in the clean California light with a rescued shepherd watching him like a partner who had already read the room, Ethan felt something warmer than amusement settle into his chest. Not peace. Not yet. But something close enough to make room for. By late afternoon, the small house had become a stage, and Ranger knew it. Sunlight slanted through the blinds in long amber bars, striping the living room rug and warming the edge of the old brown sofa Ethan still pretended belonged more to furniture than to comfort. The ceiling fan turned with a soft clicking sound, steady as a metronome, and somewhere outside a lawnmower droned 2 houses down. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a stack of mail, sorting bills from junk in the same careful way he did everything else, while Ranger lay stretched across the cool patch of floor near the back door, watching him with half-lidded eyes that suggested rest, but never quite surrender. It happened when Ethan picked up the phone and stared at the screen a little too long. He did not call anyone. He never did, not unless there was a reason, and reasons had become rare. He just looked at the glowing name of an old Marine buddy he had not spoken to in months, then set the phone back down without unlocking it. The silence that followed was thin at first, almost invisible, but it had weight to it. Ranger felt it before Ethan admitted it was there. The shepherd lifted his head, rose in one smooth motion, and patted over with that measured confidence of his, nails tapping lightly against the floorboards. Then came the sound. Not a bark. Not a whine. Something in between, low and rolling, with a strangely human cadence, like the beginning of a question. Ethan looked up. Ranger gave another. This one longer, rising at the end as if asking for an explanation. You have got to be kidding me, Ethan muttered. Ranger sat beside his chair, back straight, eyes fixed on him, and answered again. Ethan leaned back and folded his arms. No, we are not doing this right now. Ranger made a soft, offended sound that landed somewhere between protest and disbelief. It was so perfectly timed that Ethan let out a short laugh before he could stop it. The dog froze for half a second, almost startled by the sound, then gave one more dramatic reply, quieter this time, as if pleased with himself, but too dignified to show it openly. Ethan shook his head and rubbed a hand over his jaw. You think you are funny, do you not? Ranger's ears tipped forward. Another little rumble. That is not an answer. A gentler one this time. Ethan stared at him, and the absurdity of the exchange settled over the room like warm light. Not forced. Not loud. Just enough to make the air feel easier to breathe. Over the next hour, the pattern repeated itself with uncanny precision. Ethan stood to put away dishes, and Ranger offered commentary from the doorway. Ethan opened the pantry and decided against the peanut butter crackers, and Ranger objected like a disapproving supervisor. Ethan reached for the television remote, changed his mind, and sat back down, and there was Ranger again with another thoughtful little speech, as though the dog had appointed himself guardian not only of the house, but of the emotional weather inside it. By the time the shadows lengthened and the smell of evening drifted in through the screen door, dry grass, ocean air, and the faint smoke of someone grilling a late dinner, Ethan had stopped pretending it was random. Ranger did not speak to fill noise. He spoke to interrupt silence. He did it when the room grew too still, when Ethan's shoulders tightened, when memory began circling without permission. Like he had decided, in his own stubborn rescued way, that this house had gone quiet long enough. Ethan reached down and rested a hand against the thick fur at Ranger's neck. The shepherd leaned into it, calm and solid, then let out one last low remark from somewhere deep in his chest. Ethan exhaled through a tired smile. "All right," he said softly. "I hear you." Words spread faster than Ethan expected, though not because he told it. It started on a Wednesday just after sunrise at the hardware store off Mission Avenue, the one with the dusty bags of potting soil stacked by the entrance and a bell above the door that rang half a second too late. Ethan only needed two things, a box of light bulbs and a new hose nozzle for the backyard, but Ranger had insisted on coming along with such determined commentary at the front door that leaving him behind had felt less like a decision and more like surrendering to a superior officer with four paws. The morning was clear and bright, already warming toward another Southern California noon, and the parking lot shimmered faintly under a pale blue sky. Inside, the store smelled like cut lumber, fertilizer, and cold air from an old ceiling vent pushing against the heat. Ranger trotted beside the cart with calm purpose, drawing the usual glances people gave a handsome German shepherd, but he stayed close to Ethan's leg, disciplined and alert, until an older cashier with silver hair and red reading glasses leaned over the counter and smiled at him. "Well now," she said, her voice sweet and amused, "aren't you the serious one?" Ranger stopped, turned his head, and answered with a long, expressive sound so perfectly timed it startled a laugh out of her. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. "Do not encourage him," he muttered. The cashier laughed harder. "Honey, I do not think he needs encouragement." Ranger made another sound, shorter this time, almost conversational, and the teenage stock clerk at the end of aisle 6 nearly dropped a package of zip ties trying not to grin. Ethan paid for the bulbs, took the receipt, and walked out shaking his head while Ranger moved beside him with the unmistakable composure of someone pleased with his own performance. By Friday, the same thing happened at the mailbox cluster when Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down asked Ethan if the dog was always that talkative. Ranger answered before Ethan could, earning himself a delighted gasp and a hand to the heart. "Oh my goodness," she said, bending slightly. "He has thoughts." Ethan looked down at the shepherd. "Too many," he said. Ranger let out a low complaint, and Mrs. Alvarez laughed so hard she had to steady herself against the post. Even Ethan laughed then, not politely, not out of habit, but fully, with his shoulders loosening and his eyes narrowing at the corners in a way that made him look younger than grief usually allowed. It happened again the next afternoon when his friend Nate Collins stopped by with a cold 6-pack of root beer and a box of fish tacos from a place near the pier. Nate had served with Ethan years earlier and was one of the few men who still knocked instead of texting first. He stepped into the living room, glanced at Ranger, and said, "So this is the roommate I have heard rumors about." Ranger, stretched on the rug like he paid rent, lifted his head and gave a low answer that sounded suspiciously like a challenge. Nate stared for one beat, then pointed. "That dog just sized me up." Ethan took the food from him and tried to keep a straight face. "You probably failed." Ranger added another short rumble, and this time both men laughed. The room filled with the smell of grilled fish, lime, and warm tortillas, and for a little while the house did not feel like a place built around absence. It felt lived in. That was what Ethan noticed most in the days that followed. Ranger was not just making people smile. He was changing the temperature of every room he entered. He drew laughter from strangers, softened neighbors, and pulled sound out of a house that had spent too long holding its breath. And each time Ethan heard that odd, half-spoken shepherd voice answering the world around him, he felt something unfamiliar, but welcome settling in deeper. Not chaos. Not noise. Just life, returning one small conversation at a time. It took Ethan longer than it should have to notice the pattern, maybe because laughter can hide truth for a while, dressing it in something easier to carry. By the following week, Ranger had become the unofficial ambassador of the block. He had greeted the mailman with a soft, dramatic monologue, objected loudly to a skateboard rolling too close to the driveway, and once offered a string of offended remarks when Ethan dared to eat the last bite of scrambled eggs without sharing. People loved it. Mrs. Alvarez brought over homemade banana bread and stayed 10 extra minutes just to hear what the shepherd might say next. Nate started calling him the neighborhood union representative. Even the teenager at the hardware store had begun waving when Ethan pulled into the lot, asking, "Did he bring any opinions today?" Most days, Ranger delivered. He had sounds for frustration, sounds for excitement, sounds for waiting too long by the front door, and sounds that came suspiciously close to sarcasm whenever Ethan ignored him on purpose. But then there were the other moments, the quiet ones, and those were the ones Ethan could not explain away. It happened on a Thursday evening after sunset. The kitchen lights were off except for the glow above the stove, and the house had that blue-gray stillness that comes after a long day when everything begins to blur at the edges. Ethan stood at the counter with one hand resting near the sink, not doing anything, not moving toward dinner, not reaching for the television remote. Just standing there with his jaw set slightly too tight, eyes lowered to nothing at all. Ranger had been sprawled by the back door moments earlier, half asleep. Now he was up. No stretch. No hesitation. Just up and crossing the room with quiet purpose. He stopped near Ethan's knee and looked up. Then came a sound Ethan had not heard before. It was softer than the usual grumbling commentary, lower, almost careful. Not funny. Not dramatic. A small, wavering note that carried no demand in it. Only presence. Ethan glanced down and forced a little shrug. "I am fine." Ranger answered immediately, another low sound, this one shorter, like he disagreed. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. "You do not know what you are talking about." But Ranger stayed where he was, gaze steady, tail still, giving one more quiet reply that did not sound like argument at all. It sounded like refusal. Not refusal to obey. Refusal to leave. Ethan turned away, opened the refrigerator, stared inside without seeing anything, and closed it again. Behind him came the soft click of nails on the floor as Ranger followed. The dog did not make another sound until Ethan sat down at the kitchen table and rubbed both hands over his face. Then, and only then, Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's knee and let out that same gentle murmur from deep in his chest. Ethan froze. The room was silent except for the refrigerator hum and the faint rattle of wind pressing against the loose screen on the back porch. In that silence, the truth landed with a strange and humbling clarity. Ranger did not talk like this for everyone. He performed for neighbors. He amused strangers. He entertained friends. But these softer sounds, these almost human little answers, belonged to different moments entirely. They came when Ethan drifted. When his shoulders locked. When memory reached an uninvited and made the room feel smaller. It was as if the dog had drawn a line between noise and loneliness. And decided he would answer the second one every time. Ethan lowered one hand and scratched behind Ranger's ear, slow and absent at first, then with more intention. The shepherd leaned in, but did not lift his head from Ethan's knee. "You really do not like the quiet, do you?" Ethan whispered. Ranger gave a tiny response. Barely more than breath. For once, Ethan did not laugh. He just sat there in the low kitchen light, hand resting in the thick fur of a dog who had somehow learned the exact shape of his silence and understood that what had seemed like comedy all week long might be something gentler, deeper, and far more loyal than either of them had words for. The next morning came in soft and colorless, wrapped in a marine layer that blurred the palm trees beyond the fence and left a cool film on the kitchen window. Ethan woke before the alarm, as he always did, but did not get up right away. He lay still beneath the thin cotton sheet, listening to the old house settle around him, the distant rush of early traffic on the highway, the quiet tick of the ceiling fan, and the steady breathing of Ranger stretched on the rug near the bedroom door. It was a good sound, that breathing. Grounded. Present. For a long moment, Ethan stared at the pale line of dawn pressing through the blinds and let memory arrive the way it often did now, without warning and without noise. There had been another dog once, years earlier, before the rentals and the lonely routines and the careful way he kept his life folded into corners. A working dog. A disciplined shepherd with dark eyes and a calm that made younger men stand a little straighter just by watching him move. His name had been Atlas. Ethan had met him on base during training, back when both of them were younger and carried purpose like second skin. Atlas had not been playful. He had not been interested in charm. But he had known how to stay close without crowding, how to watch a room, how to settle beside a man and somehow make the world feel less careless. There had been long days then, hot wind, the scent of dust and oil on canvas gear, and nights when Ethan trusted that if Atlas was awake, someone was watching the dark with him. When that chapter of life ended, it did not end all at once. Most losses never do. They break the world quietly, then leave you to discover over time which sounds are missing. Ethan had never spoken much about Atlas after that. Not to Nate. Not to anyone. He packed the photographs into a shoebox with old challenge coins and a spare set of dog tags and slid them to the back of the hall closet, as if distance could make memory behave. For a while it worked. Or seemed to. He learned how to function without looking directly at the hollow place. He kept things clean. Kept things moving. Kept his voice even. And when people asked whether he would ever get another dog, he always gave the same answer with a small shrug and a polite half-smile. Not a good time. What he meant was simpler. He could not stand the thought of building that kind of trust again only to live with the silence that followed. Then, 3 weeks ago, he had driven inland on a mild Saturday afternoon because Nate had sent him a shelter listing with no message attached, just a picture of a shepherd sitting too straight in a concrete kennel. As if dignity were the last possession he had left. Ethan almost did not go. He told himself he was only curious. He told himself he was killing time. But he still drove the 20 miles under a washed-out sky, with dry hills on both sides of the road and old country songs low on the radio. The shelters smelled like disinfectant, damp blankets, and nervous hope. Dogs barked from every direction, some frantic, some eager, some simply lonely. Ranger had not barked at all. He had stood near the back of his kennel, lean and watchful, ears slightly angled, eyes following Ethan without any performance in them. There had been notes on the clipboard clipped to the gate. Found wandering. No chip. Estimated 3 years old. Slow to trust. Ethan had crouched without thinking. Ranger had stepped closer, not rushed, not begged, just close enough that the afternoon light caught the amber in his eyes. Then he made one sound, low and rough, not yet the strange talking Ethan knew now, but something like a quiet test. Ethan remembered the exact feeling of it, how absurdly small the moment looked from the outside, and how impossible it felt from within. As if a door he had kept locked for years had heard its name spoken softly from the other side. Across the room now, Ranger stirred in his sleep and gave a little breathy murmur, almost like an echo from that first day. Ethan sat up slowly and rested his feet on the floor. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. And for the first time in years, memory did not arrive as an intruder. It came like weather passing through, while something living and warm remained. Night came gently that day, rolling in from the coast with a cool breeze that carried the smell of salt, damp grass, and someone nearby burning cedar in a backyard fire pit. The neighborhood settled into its usual evening rhythm. Porch lights blinked on one by one. A screen door slapped shut down the block. Somewhere a child laughed, then was called inside for dinner. In Ethan's house, the lights stayed low. He had eaten little, said less, and by 9 o'clock the kitchen had fallen into that familiar hush that used to feel normal and now felt almost too quiet to trust. Ranger lay near the sliding glass door, outlined by the pale wash of moonlight on the floor, watchful without looking like it. Ethan sat at the table with a small cardboard box in front of him, the same one he had left untouched for years in the back of the hall closet. It was not large, just weathered at the corners, taped once, then untapped, then closed again. The kind of box that looked harmless until a man knew what it held. He rested both hands beside it for a long time before opening it. Inside were old photographs, a service patch, a few challenge coins dulled by time, and beneath them all, wrapped in a clean white handkerchief, a worn metal tag that caught the kitchen light with a muted silver glint. Ethan lifted it carefully. Atlas. He did not say the name aloud. He did not need to. The room changed anyway. Memory had a way of doing that, of making the air feel crowded by what was no longer there. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the tag resting in his palm. His face gave nothing away at first, but his shoulders had gone still in the way they did when he was holding more than he intended to. The refrigerator hummed softly. Wind brushed the loose edge of the screen outside. From the other side of the room, Ranger lifted his head. He watched Ethan for a moment without moving. Then he stood. There was no drama in it. No rush. Just that same quiet certainty he always carried when the house tilted toward some hidden ache only he seemed able to hear. He crossed the floor slowly and stopped beside Ethan's chair. Ethan kept his eyes on the tag. Not tonight, he said softly, though there was no edge in it. Ranger answered with a sound so low Ethan almost missed it. It was not one of the comic sounds from the kitchen or the exaggerated complaints from the front door. It was smaller than that, thinner, like a thread of sound pulled gently through the dark. Ethan swallowed and set the tag on the table. I said not tonight. Ranger gave another sound, just as soft, and rested his chin on Ethan's thigh. The warmth of it landed before the meaning did. Ethan lowered his gaze. The shepherd's amber eyes held his with that impossible steadiness, not trying to fix anything, not demanding to be understood, only staying. Then came a third sound, longer this time, quiet and wavering, almost like a voice trying not to break the silence too hard. Something in Ethan gave way then, not in collapse, not in spectacle, just in truth. A tired breath left him, and with it came a short laugh that turned, halfway through, into the kind of sound a man makes when his heart has been caught off guard. He covered his eyes with one hand and shook his head. You ridiculous dog, he whispered, smiling through the sting behind it. Ranger answered at once, one small rumble from deep in his chest, and somehow that did it. Ethan laughed again, this time fully, openly, with tears standing in his eyes and no strength left to hide them. The sound filled the kitchen, warm and broken and real, and Ranger stayed exactly where he was, leaning closer as if he had been waiting all along for that single crack in the armor. Ethan reached down and buried his hand in the thick fur. Around the dog's neck. You always know, he said quietly. Ranger gave one last soft reply, almost like a sigh. And in that low-lit kitchen, with an old dog tag on the table and a rescued shepherd keeping vigil at his side, grief did not leave. But it loosened. Just enough for laughter to sit beside it. The next morning, the house felt different. Not louder, exactly. Just warmer, as if something inside its walls had finally decided to unclench. Sunlight poured clean and gold across the kitchen floor, catching in the grain of the wooden table and lighting the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The coffee maker hissed. A gull cried somewhere overhead. Outside, the world moved with its usual California ease, sprinklers clicking on in uneven rhythms, a truck rolling past with surfboards strapped to the roof, a dog down the street barking at nothing it could prove. Inside, Ethan stood at the counter in bare feet, waiting for the toast to pop, when Ranger appeared beside him and delivered his morning opinion in a low, theatrical string of sounds that had now become as much a part of sunrise as coffee and light. Ethan glanced down, and this time he answered without hesitation. I know. I am behind schedule. You have already made that very clear. Ranger gave another remark, shorter and sharper, like a rebuttal. Ethan nodded solemnly. Fair point. The absurdity of it should have worn off by then. Instead, it had deepened into ritual. Somewhere between the hardware store, the mailbox, the fish tacos, the quiet kitchen night, and the dog tag lying no longer hidden in a box, but resting now on the bookshelf beside a framed photograph, something had shifted. Ethan had started talking back in full sentences. Not because he believed Ranger understood every word, though some days he wondered, but because the sound of his own voice no longer felt like something reserved for errands or obligation. It belonged in the house again. Ranger seemed to understand that first. Over the days that followed, their strange little conversations became the shape of ordinary life. Ethan talked while filling the water bowl, while folding laundry fresh from the dryer, warm and smelling faintly of clean cotton and soap, while checking the weather before an afternoon walk, while standing in the backyard with one hand on the fence watching the sky fade peach over the rooftops. Ranger always had something to add. Sometimes it was comic, a dramatic protest over the timing of dinner or the injustice of being asked to wait before chasing a tennis ball. Sometimes it was softer, more measured, offered only when Ethan's thoughts began wandering too far inward. Those were the moments Ethan noticed most. If he stood too long in the hallway, Ranger appeared. If he went quiet on the couch with an old memory moving behind his eyes, Ranger answered the silence before it had time to harden. And little by little, Ethan stopped resisting the interruptions. He let them change him. He called Nate first one afternoon just to ask if he wanted to catch a Padres game on television that weekend. He stayed outside longer when Mrs. Alvarez waved from her porch. He even found himself laughing in the grocery store when he passed the dog treat aisle and caught himself debating out loud whether Ranger deserved the peanut butter bones or the bacon-shaped ones. The clerk stocking Ken's soup looked over, confused, and Ethan just smiled and kept walking. By Friday evening, the windows were open to the cool air and the smell of grilled chicken from next door drifted through the screen. Ranger lay sprawled on the rug with the lazy satisfaction of a creature who believed he had personally reorganized the emotional structure of the household. Ethan sat in the armchair with his boots off, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, and looked around the room. Nothing was grand. Nothing had become magically new. The lamp still flickered if switched too quickly. The paint near the back door still needed touching up. The couch still sagged in the middle. But the house no longer felt like a bunker built for one man and his silence. It felt inhabited. Shared. Saved in small measures. Ranger lifted his head and gave a low sound from across the room, not demanding, not urgent, just checking in. Ethan met his gaze and smiled, the easy kind this time, the one that no longer had to be dragged into daylight. I am all right, he said. Ranger let out a contented little rumble and lowered his head again, as if to say that was all he had wanted to hear. Saturday arrived bright and clean, the kind of Southern California morning that made even ordinary houses look touched by mercy. Sunlight spilled across the front steps in long warm bands, and the air carried a mix of ocean salt, fresh-cut grass, and the faint sweetness of jasmine climbing a neighbor's fence. Ethan opened the front door with a mug of coffee in one hand and stood there for a moment in the easy quiet, barefoot on the cool wood floor, letting the light find him. Behind him came the familiar click of nails on the hallway boards. Ranger moved past his knee, stepped onto the porch, and sat with the posture of a soldier reviewing the neighborhood he had personally restored to order. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. A flag stirred lazily down the block. A bicycle bell rang once and faded. The world felt awake without being loud. Then Ranger tipped his head, glanced back over one shoulder, and offered a low, drawn-out sound that rolled up at the end like a question he had already asked 100 times and still expected to be answered properly. Ethan looked down at him and smiled before the dog had even finished. Yes, he said. I am coming. Ranger gave another response, shorter this time, almost satisfied, then rose and padded down the porch steps into the yard where the grass still held a trace of dew. Ethan followed with his coffee, leaning one shoulder against the post while Ranger inspected the morning with grave attention, nose lifted to the breeze, ears catching every small movement in the street. It would have looked simple to anyone passing by. A man. A dog. A quiet home at the start of the weekend. But Ethan knew better now. He knew how much grace could hide inside simple things. In the sound of paws crossing a kitchen floor. In a rescued shepherd answering back when silence got too heavy. In the way a house once built around absence could slowly learn the language of company again. He thought of the photograph on the bookshelf inside, the old tag resting beside it, no longer buried away. He thought of Atlas with gratitude instead of fear. He thought of how strange it was that healing had not come to him in the grand shape of revelation, but in low grumbles, funny little arguments, and a dog who refused to let sorrow have the final word in any room they shared. Ranger turned back toward him and made one more sound, softer now, as if reminding him not to drift too far even on a beautiful day. Ethan took a sip of coffee, rich and bitter, and walked down into the yard. "You know," he said, stopping beside the shepherd in the bright morning light, "for a dog with no official rank, you sure run this place like command staff." Ranger looked up, chest proud, and answered with a deep, pleased rumble that sounded so much like agreement Ethan laughed right there in the sun. It came easily now. Cleanly. No ambush in it. No apology either. Just laughter, warm as the day itself. Ranger stepped closer and leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg for one brief steady moment before trotting ahead toward the gate, already ready for the walk, the world, the next conversation. Ethan watched him go with the kind of expression that does not need words because it has finally found peace with them. Then he set down his mug on the porch rail, reached for the leash hanging by the door, and followed. The morning opened before them, wide and ordinary and full of small good things. And in that light, with a rescued German shepherd still talking his way through the quiet and a Marine finally answering back, the house behind them no longer felt like a place where someone had merely survived. It felt like home. In this heartfelt cinematic journey, a rescued German shepherd slowly transforms the quiet life of a U.S. Marine through warmth, loyalty, and a voice that seems to answer every lonely silence. Set near the California coast, this story blends humor, healing, and the deep bond between a soldier and his dog into one unforgettable experience for fans of animal stories. As the Marine learns to open his heart again, the rescued dog becomes more than a companion, turning everyday routines into moments of comfort, laughter, and grace. This emotional tale is perfect for viewers who love animal stories, inspirational rescue narratives, military-themed bonding stories, and uplifting dog videos with soul. With vivid atmosphere, gentle humor, and a powerful undercurrent of recovery, this is one of those animal stories that reminds us how healing can arrive in the most unexpected sounds. The Marine and the German Shepherd share a connection shaped by trust, memory, and the quiet miracle of being understood, making this a standout among animal stories for anyone drawn to loyal dogs, emotional storytelling, and heartfelt companionship. From morning conversations in a small coastal home to deeply moving moments of remembrance and renewal, this is a tender and meaningful entry in the world of animal stories, rich with hope, emotion, and the peaceful strength of a dog who refuses to let his human stay lost in silence. This story leaves behind the kind of warmth that lingers long after the final scene, securing its place among unforgettable animal stories. Character 1. White U.S. Marine, 38 years old, rugged but kind face, short brown hair, light hazel eyes, clean shave, athletic build, wearing plain olive green t-shirt and tan cargo pants, front-facing portrait, realistic cinematic lighting. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. German Shepherd, 3 years old, full body visible, strong athletic frame, sable and tan coat, alert amber eyes, upright ears, intelligent expression, standing naturally, realistic fur texture, cinematic natural lighting. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.